Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Hammons. He is a professor here at Houston Baptist University. Some of you may have actually had classes. He is also the founder of the Center for Law and Liberty, which he is initiating with some overlapping goals, I think, with my new Russell Kirk Forum here, but to simply bring additional resources, speakers, and ideas into conversation in the context of the university. He was one of the speakers. We did a program on Russell Kirk's both the Roots of American Order a few months ago for ISI, and I think we're going to take that one on a road show with ISI.
Good.
It was so well received and so well done, if I may say so, Dr. Hammons. He is going to speak to us this afternoon on the aspects of the conservative mind, particularly as they affect the interplay and the conflict of different ideologies that have come up against a given era, and in what way the conservatism, this stream of thought, has a prudent and yet effective rebuke every single time. Will you join me in welcome Dr. Hammons?
Thank you. Well, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Chris Hammons. I'm a professor of government here at the university and dean of the School of Humanities. Off or on? Okay. I'm double mic'd, so I'm getting some. You probably get some reverb back there. There we go. Okay, good. And when people find out I teach government, I usually get asked two questions. Usually, people first ask, "Well, what is it that you teach?" And I'll explain to them I teach the Constitution. And the second question I get asked is, well, how do you teach it? And I explain to them I teach it the right way. And so for those of you who have had my classes, you'll know in the freshman survey class, I make students memorize the Constitution in the final exam. They have to write it out by hand, an article and section number, which is something that most members of Congress can't do. So I tend to think in political terms. That's my sort of worldview, and I like the political aspects of Russell Kirk, and we've heard some about the historical aspects. I'm going to address a little bit more of the political aspects. I even got Winston made a comment about apparently my bootleg copy of The Conservative Mind. I like this one because it had an American flag on it. Is that so wrong? Right? I'm going to be punished for that, right? But anyway, the political aspects of Kirk, particularly, I like the second chapter of this book the best. Right? When we read things, we always find chapters that appeal to who we are and where our interests lie. And it's the second chapter on John Adams. We heard about the first part on Edmund Burke. That really sort of speaks to me. John Adams is one of my favorite historical characters. There's numerous sort of stories about him that are just very colorful. If you've ever read the David McCulloch biography of John Adams, when they made the HBO miniseries, they're just wonderful. And of course, you all know his story of being instrumental in the American cause and American independence. My favorite story of John Adams is his trip over as ambassador from the new United States to meet King George III for the first time. And this is the guy who basically, remember, caused the American Revolution, the father of independence, if you will. And apparently King George III, upon seeing John Adams for the first time, says, "So this is the Mr. Adams I've heard so much about." Right? I mean, this is the guy who cost him the North American Empire. And I always think that Adams must have just been sweating profusely, because this is a guy, they could have hauled him off in cuffs and chopped his head off or something, but nonetheless, there he is. Right? So I feel a little bit outgunned, I got to tell you. I'm the only one of the speakers who didn't know Russell Kirk. Right? I don't have any good Russell Kirk stories. I don't even have any good drinking stories. And I guess I'm sort of a boring person that way. I actually met my wife in the library while she was studying on a Friday night, eating a bowl of ramen noodles. That's about as exciting as my life has gotten, right? And but I want to talk to you about a little about the politics of Russell Kirk and the novelty of Russell Kirk. I'm a product of public schools and state higher education systems. I came to Russell Kirk later in my life when I was a graduate student. I had a professor slip it to me as if it was contraband, right? And you might get a kick out of this type of thing, but don't let anybody see it. And I never heard of him as an undergraduate, and I would wager that probably most students at most state universities would not hear of Russell Kirk. And I know we have a lot of students here. Part of my concern, I think, with what Kirk has to offer us is that it's not taught in higher education. And part of it's just a function of who we are as young people. This is a book kind of like Shakespeare that's probably better read toward the end of your life when you have this broad view of history than at the beginning of your life. It's sort of like reading Romeo and Juliet and never having experienced sort of lost love or something. It just doesn't mean much to you. And so if you have friends in school, I think this is partly a function of just the way the Generation Y, the young generation, thinks. One of the things I've noticed about this generation is they're not particularly impressed by knowledge. And I think that's one of the things that turns them off of Russell Kirk, right? His encyclopedic sort of view of the world. I mean, gone are the old days where the professor is seen or was seen as sort of the sage on the stage, as the keeper of knowledge, of someone who had read all these books and knew all these things. Today's students can Google information and instantly have it at their fingertips. And so in one of my classes, we're studying the American founding, and just to keep it lively, I'm telling some stories of Pocahontas in Jamestown. And I asked, who did Pocahontas wind up marrying? And I hear this click, 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 John Rolfe. And they go back to ordering shoes on Zappos, right? And so it makes me feel kind of useless. And so I think when people look at Russell Kirk, part of the question is, well, why would I want to know all this stuff, right? Another thing I've noticed is that students today typically have sort of shorter attention spans. Right? If you do these sort of video clips for your classes and presentations, the people who teach all this video technology stuff will tell professors to keep the video clips at about 7 minutes or less, because that's about the attention span of today's students. And so a book like this is pretty daunting, like to hand this to somebody and say, read this, because I've never read this much in my life. The books are almost sort of too much of a commitment. And I actually had a young woman in a class one time tell me that she just really didn't do a whole lot of reading because she wasn't into the book thing. Which I'm not exactly sure what that means. So, but it makes, again, people wonder, you understand why that Kirk may be sort of intimidating to a lot of people. But I think what troubles me the most about some students today is, and this is adults as well, but most people do not have a good sense of their own country's history. And it bothers me tremendously, but I see it in small ways and in big ways. For instance, a lot of students get the fundamental story of the American founding mixed up. And I cannot tell you how many times I have heard people say or argue that we first set up a government here and then declare independence to defend it. It's a true story, I even had one student write a bizarre essay about George Washington drafting the Constitution and then English punishing us by declaring independence. That is a true story. It was so revisionist. I didn't even know how to begin to apply comments to it. Right? It was either brilliant in a Harry Turtledove sort of way, or just insane. Right? Another misconception sometimes that students have in not knowing their own history is that many believe the U.S. Constitution was created from scratch. That this was sort of the product of these brilliant minds and enlightened ingenuity. It's sort of the miracle in Philadelphia model, right? That these people came and thought this up together. Most students don't know much about the men who drafted the Constitution. In one case, I asked a young woman who her favorite founding father was. And when she struggled to answer, it dawned on me that she wasn't sorting through the list of founding fathers to pick her favorite, or even that she was trying to come up with a name just to play the game. What bothered me is that she didn't understand the concept of founding father, or she had no clue what I was asking. And the danger here is not just a lack of historical knowledge. The danger here is that most students today and many adults don't understand the key concepts on which our nation was founded. Fundamental concepts like liberty, natural law, constitutionalism, or even founding father. Concepts that are essential to preserving our American Republic. So how did this happen? How did we get to this point where the fundamental principles that make this country exceptional are on the verge of being forgotten, or in many cases are not taught in school, and in some quarters are even treated with hostility? And the reason is that our national founding was an inherently conservative experience. And some people don't like that. It's why if you were at a different school, a state school like I went to at the University of Texas at Austin, you would never hear of Russell Kirk. It's why a group like ISI would probably be chased off campus or heckled at schools like that. A recurrent theme in Kirk's writing is that our American political culture is fundamentally rooted in conservatism. And I don't mean conservatism like Ronald Reagan conservatism or John Boehner conservatism, but conservatism in the truest sense of the word. That our political system is based on the preservation, the conservation of values and beliefs that have been held by Americans since the founding and long before that. Kirk argues that our American nation is not founded on revolutionary or new ideas. It's not a product of the Enlightenment. That's what we teach kids in the public schools to bolster their self-esteem. It prevents childhood obesity, which leads to promiscuity and adult diabetes. The reality is that our nation was built on very old principles, right? Principles that were held dear to our founding fathers, the colonists before them, and the countless generations of Englishmen before that. And the values and beliefs that inform the American experience, Kirk tells us in his Roots of the American Order, come from Athens and Rome, Jerusalem and London, and converge in the 18th century city of Philadelphia to birth a new order of the ages, but a new order grounded in old ideas. To paraphrase Edmund Burke, who's Kirk's favorite conservative, the founding conservative, the American Revolution was not a fight for something new or radical. It was a fight for conservative principles, right, to prevent a revolution. And that's the problem. Now, I know this comes as no surprise to many of you, but conservatism sometimes gets a bad rap in higher education. The standard textbook definition of conservatism, and I've seen this myself teaching freshman government and using the textbooks, is that conservatives are backward-looking, cling to the old ways, and resistant to change. Right? And I've seen those words used because I took them from the survey government books that we sometimes use. While to the contrary, liberalism seeks progress, change, and looks to the future. It's no surprise that most students, when they read those definitions, would prefer to be liberal. Right? As a result, there's this academic bias against teaching Kirk's work in most of the academy and most colleges and universities, because it's viewed as an endorsement of conservatism. And conservatism is seen as backward-looking, anti-intellectual, and unenlightened. Now the irony here, and this is what Kirk does so well in The Conservative Mind, is to show how this long train of conservative intellectuals contribute to the progress of the human condition despite liberalism. And it's because of this that Kirk is largely dismissed by most liberals in the academy. Right, in The Conservative Mind, Kirk shows that conservative thinkers since Burke offer an alternative to utopian thinkers like Owen and Bellamy and Bentham and Marx. Men who believe that you can change human nature, particularly if you have the right leaders, with the right education, and the proper intellectual outlook. These liberal philosophers are largely utopian dreamers and pot smokers. Now, I added that last part just to make sure you're paying attention. I knew I'd be speaking after lunch, so I'm just a little check, right? But these men believe that social and political values are merely artificial constructs that can be changed and re-administered depending on who's in power. That human nature is malleable and can be shaped and guided by smart men and government authority. Conservatism rejects the notion that political values can be imposed anew from the outside, that human nature is malleable, and that a new social order can be built to the exclusion of deeply held values. To the contrary, Kirk says, conservatives believe that a people's core values and beliefs are worth conserving in order to build a stable and lasting political system. Conservatives believe that political systems should be designed to reflect human nature rather than change it. Throughout his work, Kirk demonstrates the conservatism of the American experiment. He writes in The Conservative Mind that no matter how admirable a constitution may look on paper, it will be ineffectual unless the unwritten constitution, the web of custom and convention, affirms an enduring moral order of obligation and personal responsibility. In other words, for constitutional government to work, it must be based on the existing warp and woof of a people, not a completely new fabrication. The lesson that Kirk imparts is that you can't make the world anew, and nor should you want to. And The Conservative Mind is dedicated to showing conservative responses to liberal claims to the contrary. And this is why Kirk bothers liberals so much, the children of the Enlightenment, because they believe that social engineering and human ingenuity are the answer to most of the world's problems. They believe, in essence, that they are the ones they have been waiting for. Now, in my classes, I do a little bit to channel Russell Kirk without attribution, so that I come across as very wise and learned. Right? And I explain that conservatism is both forward-thinking and compassionate. And taking a cue from Kirk, I demonstrate this by looking at our most famous founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, how many of you remember that line from the Declaration, the famous line which begins that all men are created equal? Right? You probably had to memorize that in third grade like I did. And while it's the most beautiful and memorable part of the Declaration, the famous line about equality is only part of a larger philosophy that often gets overlooked. There's an entire paragraph in the Declaration that precedes this one. And I like the legal arguments they lay out against the king and so forth, but I think the first paragraph is even more important, although we memorize the second one, right? And it's that paragraph that we leave out sometimes because it's more complex, it's confusing for school kids to understand, and it mentions God, and of course they can't go there in the public schools, right? And the first paragraph of the Declaration refers to the laws of nature and nature's God. This is what philosophers and theologians will refer to as the natural law. It's a universal law that binds all men and imposes a universal standard of justice, of right and wrong on everybody, everywhere, at all times. No one is exempt. We are all equal under the natural law as intended by God. That's the equality that Jefferson is really referring to in the famous second paragraph. And these ideas of God-given rights, natural law, and political equality are not new or revolutionary. To the contrary, these are very old concepts, concepts that Jefferson borrows from great thinkers as far back as Aquinas or Cicero or even Plato. And what about that famous phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? This was a phrase that Jefferson borrowed from Locke to indicate that the things protected by natural law, there are things protected by natural law which even limits the power and scope of legitimate government. But this too is an old idea. It can be traced back as far as Aristotle, who says that the purpose of government is to protect people's happiness. For why else would a free people establish government? These ideas of life and liberty, happiness and natural law were so valued by Englishmen that they were enshrined in famous documents that you probably studied, like the Magna Carta, or the Petition of Right, or the English Bill of Rights. And so if you look closely at the Declaration, you won't find much originality or novelty in this beautiful document. But it wasn't meant to be original or novel. It was meant to be familiar. Jefferson turned to old ideas for a worthy cause. It's revolutionary only in the sense that it's a 360-degree return to fundamental principles. It's a conservative document. A little over a decade later, the forces of conservatism again converge in Philadelphia, if they ever left. And the 55 men who show up from 12 colonies, Rhode Island abstaining, there's something wrong with those people even to this day, right, arrive to construct a government designed to protect the liberty of Americans, yet provide enough energy and efficiency to maintain order. And for 3.5 months in Philadelphia, in the heat and humidity that would make a Houstonian proud, these men struggled to produce what would eventually come to be held up as one of the great achievements of human history, our Constitution. Now there's this mythology that these great men converge on Philadelphia, these men of the Enlightenment, to create this new constitutional government from scratch. That it stands as a tribute to human ingenuity and progressive thinking. But the reality is that they searched not for new ideas, but sought to implement trusted ones, ideas that had proven their worth over time. From Aristotle, they took the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. From Cicero, they learned about the dangers of democracy, the threats that one man can pose to a republic, and the importance of law and tradition. From the medieval world, our founders embraced the concept of natural law, that there's a higher good than just what the government dictates to us. And it's this natural law principle that makes constitutionalism possible, because the natural law places limits on what even government can do. From Christianity, they embraced the idea of covenant theology, which forms the basis of our belief that political agreements, particularly those on paper, are binding and sacred. This tradition they inherited from our Pilgrim Fathers, who drafted the famous Mayflower Compact and bound themselves to it with pledges to each other and to God, and in doing so planted the seeds of constitutionalism in the virgin American soil. From England, our founders drew their legal theory and understanding of law. They particularly liked Blackstone, who argued that law is not merely a tool for the benefit of the strong and the powerful, but has a duty to a higher cause. And while the founders drew lessons from the ancient world in their mother country, their own colonial charters and early state constitutions provided practical experiences in constitutionalism decades before they ever met in Philadelphia. In short, the 3.5 months the founding fathers spent during that hot summer in Philadelphia in 1787 was not spent in toil and sweat because they knew too little and were making this stuff up from scratch. The reason they spent so much time in Philadelphia arguing over the design of our proposed national constitution was because they knew too much, and they drew on thousands of years of history and experience and lots of different ideas from great thinkers to pull it all together. And that, my friends, is the whole point of what Kirk is trying to tell us. The beauty of this American experiment, Kirk notes, is in its conservative nature. Rather than starting anew, it picks and chooses from the greatest ideas of history regarding human happiness and individual development. It rejects what has failed in the past, but embraces and conserves what has been shown to work, based not on feelings or philosophy or dreams, but on experience. And it's this fundamental conservatism which explains why America has been so successful. It's why people still come here from all over the world to escape tyranny and oppression. It's why immigrants look to America as a land where you can still make something of yourself, regardless of your race or your religion or your circumstance. It's why people come here from all over the world, like China and Vietnam and Mexico, Pakistan and Nigeria, because they see the opportunity that America presents. And within a generation, their children are lawyers and doctors, architects and business owners. It's where a people with little hope come to pursue what is still known worldwide today as the American dream. The founders, Kirk argued, built a government that worked by conserving principles that worked, because, to paraphrase John Adams, Kirk's favorite of the American founding fathers, the founders fundamentally cared about the prosperity and happiness of generations unborn. The modern academy today is still largely a place of Enlightenment ideals, utopian philosophy, and social engineering. The danger here is that our American experiment will only last as long as the principles and ideals on which are preserved and promoted. And Kirk's admonition to us is that if we are really interested in preserving what the founders built, we need to focus on building the conservative mind, not just conservative policies. We need universities and organizations that preserve and promote the great ideas from great books and great thinkers that have helped shape Western civilization in our own nation. We should focus not just on politics and economics, but also on things like literature and art and poetry and movies and music. And fortunately, we have places like HBU and professors like Professor Elliott and groups like the ISI and students like you who understand that victory in this struggle requires more than success at the ballot box. It requires us to remember what Kirk tries to teach us in the conservative mind, and that is that progress is not always the same as change, and that new ideas are not always the same as great ideas. So thank you very much for allowing me to come and speak with you, and I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.